What does it mean to see something? What is a thing? We take the material for granted in our daily lives, but upon close inspection, our definitions break down when describing things materially. While it is true on the one hand, our quote-unquote world is simply the geography we exist in physically, the classical 3 dimensions, we also know on a level so fundamentally deep within us so as to remain unconsciously adhered to, that it is the landscape of meaning. We are not simply in some objective material realm, though that is also true. We exist in the teleological realm of our narratives. We see the objective world through the lens of our mind's internal stories. We do not analyze things in the material world simply according to their matter, and even if this were possible, the categories that we would use to differentiate one thing from another would all require some relative reason for doing so. Why is it when we see a landscape, we separate trees from grass, from sky, from ground, from people, etc.? Aren't all of these things linked together by simple fact of existing spatially? What is it that divides and measures the totality of the landscape into pieces? I believe the sword by which we cut reality into pieces is narrative. And narrative is also how we assemble a coherent, comprehensible picture of that reality. For example, we do not refer to a chair as its constituent parts, the 3 pounds of wood, 2 ounces of metal, a few ounces of paint, etc., because we know what a chair is, and we have the narrative that this object is used for, sitting. A chair is the name we give to the unity of these parts, their purpose. The chair, as with the stop sign example I gave in the introduction, exists as a teleological object because of the shared purpose its parts have within the narrative of our lives. We often also evaluate distances this way. We are not simply in a spatial realm when we are on vacation. We are far away from home. There are many examples of this, but suffice it to say, we do not simply see some objective world objectively. We see our subjective stories, and it is through these stories that we perceive the objective world. If my assumption is correct about stories and myths being humanity's way of connecting each of our individual processors or brains with others to create a larger entity called a culture, and then that culture stores up its data for later use by later cultures, then I think an issue plaguing the unpacking of these files is often due to the translational errors found in shifts in cultural paradigms. We have both a bandwidth problem and a problem of memory. Words change, subtleties are lost, and we become isolated on the island of our own culture, unable to translate the valuable data found in others. This is akin to a literalist not being able to find the core truth of a metaphoric aphorism, say, quote-unquote, a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. They miss the point because they cannot or will not interact with the abstract layer underneath their own language, perhaps ignorant by their own prideful assumption that their culture, language, etc. are the defaults, and thus cannot translate a thing they do not understand into something they can. I've jokingly referred to this phenomena as the left brainification of modern culture, and I plan on talking about that in full in a later video. But suffice it to say that in order to translate between 2 languages, core abstractions like nouns, verbs, etc. must be distilled, so both parties can notice their presence within their idiosyncratic manifestations. Think of these abstractions like building blocks that can be of any color, but are used the same regardless of their veneer. I say all of this to get to this point. As I said in the preface, there is a split in the modern world between the quote-unquote physical sciences and the quote-unquote meta, meaning beyond, physics. The goal of the materialist scientist is to find out at its core what the nature of reality is built of. To a materialist, a quote-unquote thing is what it quote-unquote is. To the materialist, the core of reality is a material substance. This is in contrast to the teleological view, in which the core nature of reality is a why, not a what. In the teleological worldview, It is not some cork or string that is the base material that all things are built of, but a telos or a purpose. And it is this telos that acts as the core building block of the material universe. So materialism says it's a what, and teleology says it's a why. But why does the materialist scientist search for the fundamental what that the material world is made of? Why is this even a curiosity? If it is simply an is, does it not suffice to say it is? Why does what it is matter so much? It seems to me the materialist is in pursuit of this base matter because there is some value in understanding it. Perhaps it might give us clues for how to navigate reality, what we should do with our time, where we are going and how we got here, etc. In other words, why? These two schools are in pursuit of the same thing, the bedrock of reality from which to measure all according to. Yet they swear up and down that they are fundamentally opposed. Are they in truth only opposed in their phraseology and the complications arising from the implications of their idiosyncratic phraseology? They use different words to describe the same phenomena, and thus they are convinced they are in search of and describing different things. Put another way, the religious is attempting to give a quote-unquote what to their why through ritual, theology, personal growth, etc., while the materialist has a quote-unquote why at their core, driving the pursuit of their quote-unquote what. While I believe the materialist language and worldview is ultimately dangerous at worst, and impotent at providing a coherent explanation of reality at best, it is one of my goals to at least bridge the language between what could be called the secular and religious, so we can figure out where the real disagreements lay, beyond the semantic. The materialist framing of our modern culture hamstrings our ability to interact with our past, like a new operating system that can't unpack the zip files left to us by our ancestors. It is also hamstringing our ability to make a map we can share in our present to better plot a course to our survival. Our modern materialist culture could be thought of as a person who will not journal or go to therapy about some past trauma, so they live in a moment-to-moment state of ignorance, unable to fix their unhealthy patterns or mental problems because they have no understanding to the underlying causes. They don't know how they got where they are because they will not communicate with their past. And thus, wherever they are is simply that, where they are. It's like the cultural version of someone losing their memory every morning. We have little idea how we got here, save the immediate clues we see around us, and have no real way to know where we came from and which way we should go. Thus, we are reduced to immediate needs and impulses. Materialist culture is adrift in a sea of impulsive hedonism because its language and paradigm keeps it from being able to communicate with its past in a clear way. We have no story to trust other than, quote-unquote, pursue your liberty and happiness. And to boot, this worldview is so foundational to how we see the world that trying to point it out in many people is as difficult as getting them to see their own eye color without a mirror. You'd say, "You have green eyes," and they'd say, "I don't see green anywhere except the grass." This phenomena is especially frustrating in the religiously inclined within the West, but more on that later. I get it though, it's hard to see outside of your worldview. How can you see what's beyond your horizon? How can you know what you don't know? To know what you don't know, you need to explore. But to explore, there needs to be a spot left open in your worldview for mystery or the unknown. The issue with modern materialism and postmodernism is the utter blind faith by which its adherents accept its precepts. It's like people thinking they don't have an accent, but everyone else does. They lack the self-awareness to see that they have an accent too. Their starting position is not the starting position. Their accent isn't the quote-unquote normal one. It's one of many. They lack the ability to see their own worldview from an objective vantage because they're under the delusion that their worldview is the objective vantage. The myth of what I suppose could be called modern secularism or popular culture is that it is the baseline, and its role as standard is simply taken for granted by the everyday individual. The secular individual does not think of themselves as adhering to a religion, a cult, a worldview, etc. They simply think their life and beliefs are the baseline standard of reality. To them, to be quote-unquote secular is to somehow be partaking in the objective reality of the world. This delusion utterly hamstrings their ability to analyze their own beliefs, because to them, they simply don't have beliefs. They're secular. They cannot explain to you how the secular world arrives at moral truths like murder being wrong or inclusion being right, etc., because in the myth of secularism, these truths are somehow self-evident, regardless of their effervescent and malleable nature over time. Somehow slavery at one point in the secular world was acceptable, yet now it is not. Where did this updated patch of morality come from? The false confidence the postmodern mind has in its understanding of the universe is the confidence of a blind man running along a cliff's edge. Or like someone watching Monty Python and the Holy Grail thinking it's historic, and then believing our ancestors were simply ignorant, stupid, or unenlightened. To belabor the point, we're the one at the party who proudly proclaims, "Well, actually, that's not true," in great self-satisfaction, in response to the self-aware sarcastic statement made by someone else in the group. We think we're the one critiquing, but to everyone else we've made ourselves the butt of the joke. Our literalism, as a result of what Nietzsche called killing God, has made us the awkward left brain of history that, like the person at the party who misinterpreted the joke, is utterly confident that it knows everything because it can't know what it doesn't already know. We think we're deconstructing our forefathers, but we are the one at the party that everyone's laughing at. We're the emperor with no clothes who doesn't know he's naked because everyone for the moment is playing along. Because you cannot derive an ought from an is, materialism leaves the only interpretive lens to be subjective experience and power. With no spirit, there is no way to ever fully understand someone's texts, as understanding in the materialist and eventually postmodern paradigm is ironically akin to empirical knowledge. And since objective knowledge is impossible for a subjective being, the whole of the world is rendered incomprehensible. There is no way for two subjective perspectives to be reconciled within a materialist or postmodern paradigm. This framing is immediately recognized as the postmodernist critical theory and deconstruction of the past. And it seems to me that postmodern critical theory has the awareness level of Dwight from The Office, who is confident in his critical analysis of which bear is best. I want to argue that it is somewhat logically coherent, though perversely so, that if you start with an is, your why as a narrative, being contingent upon an is, will inevitably become the self. And as we know, one's self being the center of interpretation is what psychologists often call narcissism. The self becomes the why, because in a materialist or relativist paradigm, what's pleasurable is determined by the individual, and what's morally right is what pragmatically works. But who decides what is working? If there is only the subjective, then reality is simply a battleground of wills in which the mightiest decides what is true. One might say, well, can't every individual simply do what they want? What's wrong with that? But what if their wants impede or harm another individual? How do you settle disputes between two individuals, quote-unquote, following their bliss, when each of their blisses put them at odds? My point is this. The materialist and eventually postmodern paradigms are incoherent to such a degree that when taken to their logical conclusions, there is nothing within their paradigms that helps or allows for separate individuals to live, work together, or reconcile, and that the ultimate end of taking these worldviews serious is existentially detrimental to every level of human interaction. If every cell in a living organism were to have an idiosyncratic worldview or direction, the body itself is in a state of what we call decay. Without a unifying direction or DNA that each cell can follow, we can't even call it a body, for a body by definition is a unity of parts.